I'm really excited to have Bill Coleman speak here today. I can't think of any better person to talk about the history of Silicon Valley from the perspective of both an entrepreneur and a VC. He's been a serial entrepreneur. He's just always extremely active. So started out initially developing the very first spreadsheet in the world, VisiCal, and then also a suite of office tools from there. Then became an executive at Sun and developed a number of products there. And then he started a company which many of you might have heard of called BEA Systems, in which he was Bill, B was the B of BEA, along with his two colleagues, Ed and Alfred. They only raised one round of financing, a Series A from that basically was the only financing round before they went public. And then they also were the fastest growing software company to reach $1 billion in annual revenue. And it's a record that still holds today, if that's correct. And then since then, the company was sold to Oracle for $8.5 billion. So this was way back in the day before there was a lot of hype around unicorn companies reaching $1 billion. Bill already basically created the big unicorn, the decacorn. So since then, Bill's been keeping extremely active. He started another company called Cassatt, which was a software enterprise company. And then he's also been a venture capitalist at Alsop Louie Partners, which is how I've gotten to know him for the past 5 or 6 years. And then since he doesn't have enough to do, he also is now running Veritas following its spin out from Symantec a couple months ago. So we had one class reading, which I thought was a really interesting quote that Bill shared in terms of believing in the educational power of failure, so much that his hiring practices are founded on it. So he and his team try to hire people who have been at a failed company, as they know when things are going both right and wrong. So the quote that I really enjoyed from this week's readings were, Bill said, "I've had failures. VisiCorp was a failure, and so was Desk Systems. At BEA Systems, when I was putting together my senior staff, I wanted people that were in at least one company that had failed." You learn not just about failure and how to make things work, you learn the psychology of failure and how you react to it. If it's the first time you're learning you probably aren't keeping the momentum going in your company. So I thought that was a really awesome quote. And in addition to everything that Bill does in the startup scene and entrepreneurship scene, he's also been a very generous philanthropist. So he is the founder and president of the Coleman Institute for Cognitive Disabilities at the University of Colorado, which he started and funded. And he's also served on a number of boards, such as the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, as well as University of Santa Clara. So thank you, Bill. I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Ernestine. I used to call it the University of Santa Clara. It's not the University of Santa Clara. Santa Clara is the name of a saint. It's Santa Clara University. It's a Jesuit school, but at any rate. So I just want to get to know you a little bit. So I'm going to ask a few questions. First, how many of you in here want to be entrepreneurs? Okay. How many of you in here have already been an entrepreneur? Here we go. So we're moving along. How many of you want to be in venture or private equity? How many of you have already been in venture or private equity? Boy, you've done everything. Okay, so how many are from the business school? Okay, School of Engineering? Law? Medicine? We've had medicine in this course before. All right. Did I miss anybody? School you're in? How many are getting a degree in computer science? So all you with your hand up, stay after class because I want you to help me change the future of information technology. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about the history of Silicon Valley. I'll start with just a brief little bit overview of a little bit about venture capital. Some people can trace some stuff back to the 19th century, but the first venture capital like we know it actually started in the 30s. The Rockefeller family was a leader. They've been a leader in a lot of venture capital through history. But it was almost all East Coast. up until the 60s. I mean, virtually all the East Coast. It was very hard to get funding out here. From 60 to 79 was really the founding years for venture capital, especially where we're going to talk about out here and on Sand Hill Road. That's when most of the big names you know in venture capital were formed, right? And then 80 to 95 was the real growth years. And I'll talk about all the details here, where the money started to really go up. And I'll talk about that when I get into Silicon Valley. And then, of course, 95 to 99, I got to ride that boom. You know, what we used to say after that happened, just give me one more boom. This time I'd know how to really do it. And then 2000 to 2010 was the bust and what's called the lost decade for venture capital. I'll talk about the returns here in a minute, but it was horrible. Most 2000, especially that year, 2000 era fund investments lost lots of money. You know, I mean, it was the rare 2000 investment that actually made money over that period. If you hadn't been started before that and had enough momentum to bridge yourself with cash and grow, you probably weren't going to make it. You know, there were especially in 2001, there were months where hundreds of venture-backed companies were going out of business. It was not a pretty sight. Then 2011 to now has actually been a very interesting time. It really does look good. I'll talk about those returns in a second. But very recently, things are slowing down, especially in software. So the key thing that venture capitalists look for is what's their internal rate of return. In other words, you take the number of dollars invested over the period of time, you take that whole period of time for returns, and you normalize it back and say, how much percent did that money grow each year? And you know, the golden ring is 25 or more. If you can get that, you're really golden, literally. But so from during the 1980s, it went from about 10% to about 20% on average, which is really pretty good. From 1990 to 1996, it was 10%. Anybody have a guess at what it was in 1999? 80%. These are funds that monetized. Wouldn't you like to get 80% on your money every year? That's almost double. You don't take many years till you can even put $100 away and retire for the rest of your life. But that was obviously unsustainable. 2000, it was 0. And now it's about 20. So, but if we look within that now, and we look at the exit multiples, so you take those things and you normalize them all back out to the end, and we started with 100 million, and we ended with 200 million, and we've got a double, right? From 2007, in 2007, which obviously was before the bust, if you take all the major industries, there's about 6 of them that are tracked as keys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7, and then there's this thing called other, right? In 2007, the return was 2x, and I singled out software. That return was 1.5, so it was a little lower. Software's a little more volatile than most. In 2009, the return was 0 and 0. The bust really happened. Last year was 2.8 overall and 3.5 for software. So if you even normalize from 2007 to 2015, even with that dip in between, you have about a 50% rise during that time. So this has not been after the first 7 years, after that time where everything was flat, the last part of the decade wasn't too bad. So Ernestine talked about Alsop Louie, where I worked, and she She's still a partner there, an associate, senior associate, I don't know, partner. Oh, congrats. Yeah. Whoa, that's a big deal. It's a big deal because you get carry. Carry is how you get the return. 20% of the gain on the fund after the first 1x, going up to 25 after, And our first fund was a 2006 fund. So, that's where market was pretty high, then it dove down and came back up. Well, we had 2 unicorns in that fund, and we have the highest multiple return of venture capital for that period. So now, there weren't a lot of really big winners in 2006, but we lucked out. One of the unicorns, we had to actually pivot twice, change the whole business model twice. And in the end, Twitch was bought by Amazon for about $1 billion after a bidding war between Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Yahoo. So that's just a little background to give you some of the economics and thoughts. You're going to get lots of stuff on venture capital and what the model is and what the rounds are and all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about Silicon Valley. So everybody has their own opinion. I believe there are 2 founders of Silicon Valley. Can anybody take a guess? One of them, first hint, one of them was a whole career at Stanford. The other one won the Nobel Prize for co-inventing the transistor. Okay, William Shockley he wasn't really, even though his PhD and all that, he wasn't really the scientist that co-invented the technology transistor. He was a program manager. And he, there was a big sort of controversy that went on in those years because he took a lot of credit. He had a big personality. So he decided to leave Bell Labs, and he wanted to come form his own lab, and he wanted to do it in the West Coast. And at that point, all of what became semiconductors and electronics work basically was done on the East Coast. So he came out here, and he was going to move it to Los Angeles. But he came up and looked at all these orchards, and he met a guy by the name of Frederick Terman. How many of you heard of Frederick Terman? Okay. So Frederick Terman got his bachelor's at Stanford, and he got his master's at MIT, taught at Stanford for 26 years, was the dean of engineering for 4 years, and then was the provost for 10 years until 1965. He passed away in '82, so he was around as an emeritus when I was in computer science. And he is renowned as the person who took Stanford engineering department and made it a global competitor. He had this philosophy about hiring really, really great people. So why is he a co-founder of Silicon Valley? Well, let's see. He had a few students. 2 of them founded Hewlett-Packard, 1 founded Varian, 1 founded Litton, and there's a litany of others, right? And then in 1954, he met this guy named William Shockley. And he convinced him to start his company here. So William had some trouble getting money because everybody he talked to knew he wasn't a businessman. But he got some money. He got I think it was $1 million. I can't remember. From, begins with a B. I'm skipping on the name. Who thought it would be good that he would invent great stuff that's good for the world, but he didn't expect a return on his investment. And he wasn't disappointed. He didn't get a return on his investment. So Shockley decided he was going to hire the best engineers. No one on the East Coast would come. So he decided he was going to hire fresh PhD students, the best he could find. And he ended up hiring about 30 of them. But 8 of them became what was known as the traitorous 8. And they, about a year after the lab was started, they all deserted. There was so much tension between Shockley and the engineers that they just deserted. And they were all fresh young PhDs. You know, they were born between 1923 and 1927. And so here we are, 1957. So they were all 30 or less. And they convinced Fairchild, there was Fairchild Camera and Fairchild Aircraft at that time, to fund them, and this was for just over $1 million, with a stock division that they all obligated back to Fairchild as a loan that they're going to have to pay $3 million to get their stock back. Fairchild was really successful, but the Treacherous Eight joined, built this company, and there's something called Fairchildren, because dozens and dozens of companies were formed out of Fairchild. One of them, two of the Treacherous Eight, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore founded Intel. Another, Eugene Kleiner, founded Kleiner Perkins. Another of the Fairchildren, not one of the Treacherous Eight, Jerry Sanders, founded AMD. So I claim these two gentlemen, because you can take Hewlett-Packard forward on that realm, and you can take the whole semiconductor industry forward on that realm, are the founders of Silicon Valley. I've never heard anybody else say that, but that's my claim, and I'm going to stand by it. Okay, so let me tell you how the mechanism on how technology has driven the success of venture capital, right? So it starts with venture capital doesn't work well on continuous innovation. They don't work well on market transformations. Why? Because it takes too long. And if it takes a long time, the incumbents have time to co-opt the market, right? So this is why between 2000, when there was all of venture capital on Sand Hill Road, I say that euphemistically, it wasn't all, but most, decided the next wave is clean tech. Everybody was investing in clean tech. John Doerr went crazy about clean tech. There was a Churchill Club at Stanford in 2005 on clean tech. And there were 4 of us on the panel, and 3 of them were in clean tech. And when the question, what's the future of clean tech? And I said, well, clean tech's going to be great. It's just going to be a total bust for venture capital. And everybody looks at me and I said, this is the reason. Venture capital thrives on market disruptions. A disruption is something that requires a change in not just the technology, but the business model. And it's happened so fast that it forces customers to adopt the new thing, right? So now Drucker has a rule for this. It's called switching costs, right? And what it requires is it requires a 10x improvement. I've been in companies where I could go in and literally show them how I could cut their entire IT cost in half, and they don't care. That's not enough to justify switching costs. It's a 10x, right? So in Sun in 1987, we were selling $25,000 workstations replacing $500,000 mini computers. You had the big 3 mini computer sellers, HP, DEC, the company that HP ended up buying, who was the number 2 computer company in the world for a long time, and Hewlett-Packard, right? So now, of those, the only one that thrived through the 80s was Hewlett-Packard, because they reinvented themselves. They literally threw away the old thing and went to the new thing. But during that time, those big companies, they could not possibly compete with us to sell their computers at $25,000. They cost them 5 times as much as that to even manufacture it, let alone ship it and support it and all those other things. So customers were just flying to it. And who flew to it first? Engineers, manufacturing automation. This is all where these mini computers were. I remember back in my Visicorp days in the early 1980s, the computer everybody wanted to work on was a VAX 11780. So we finally got big enough to buy a VAX, right? In the morning they turned it on. It was a Monday morning. After a weekend, you walked in. Do you remember computer paper used to be these big fan folds? Well, They had a program you could write messages on it, and it was front of the building, "We are vaccinated," right? Well, so now, 7 years later, here's what happens on a vax. It's a really great computer, and when half dozen people are on it, it works great. When 20-some people are on it, you type, and then you wait for the characters to reflect back on the screen. Engineers didn't like that. All of a sudden, we gave them a $25,000 computer, productivity went through the moon, and every engineer was buying it. And the same thing was happening in factory automation. They could do with this $25,000 computer what a big Data General Eclipse or HP 3000 that cost 10 times as much was selling. That's disruptive innovation. It happens so fast, and in disruption, only a startup can win. Because what's called the innovator's dilemma, the guy who, the incumbents can't change their business model fast enough. And you know what they do? Innovator's dilemma. They go talk to their customers and ask them what they need. What do you think their customers are going to tell them? We need this feature and that feature. They're not going to tell them, throw away your whole business and go over here. So it ends up, almost all the companies that are big today in technology who didn't exist in 1980 or 1970 were the startup that's disrupting markets, whether it's Intel or Compaq or Microsoft or Oracle or you name it. It's disruptive innovations. So that's what drives this. So now before I go through the history of Silicon Valley, I want to tell you what the model of cycles of innovation. I wrote a paper about 10 years ago entitled Evolution of the Computer Age from 1960 to 2040. And it's just based on a very simple model. You know, about every 10 years since 1960, a new set of technologies has gotten to the point that it can trigger one of these dislocations. And it's not just the technology. It's the technology forces entire changes of business model. The most vulnerable time any established company has is if their business model is forcing to be changed. That's when market shares change. Otherwise, it's just one of these kind of battles all the time. So about every 10 years, you have a disruption. And I call those cycles. A cycle is 30 years long. So you have invention, boom and bust, 10 years of build out and consolidation, and 10 years of commoditization. Now, let's talk about how that, I'll give you an example, semiconductors, right? 59 and 60, Kilby at TI and Noyce at Fairchild invented what we now call the integrated circuit. You know, semiconductor technology applied in a multiple whatever. It took about 10 years, but by the end of the 70s, all sorts of semiconductor companies were being funded all over the place. By the way, semiconductor was, until the 70s, SEMI-conductor. You remember, these are engineers, right? So then we had a bust. Now, most of these busts occur around the time of a recession. Obviously, it makes money, harder or whatever. And that happened very nicely around 71, 72. But in 1970, Intel made memory chips, and they hand-assembled them. I don't think we're going to have a big revolution with hand-assembled memory chips. So what did we have to do in the 80s? We had to do two things. I call this build-out. One, we had to invent semiconductor manufacturing equipment to get high velocity there. And number two, we had to invent the capabilities needed for Collins radio vacuum tube engineers to learn how to use these new semiconductor things. It was interesting. When I graduated from the Air Force Academy, I had taken a lot of EE courses, and not one word was mentioned about semiconductors. When I went back to Stanford in 1975, not one word was talked about on this analog logic anymore. I mean, that changed like that. But what had to get invented was CAD, CAM, and something called in-circuit emulators, so you can emulate this thing before you've built it. And then a short-term profession called application engineers. Now, in 1978, if you were a reputable engineer, you would sit at your desk and have your picture taken, and behind you would be a bookshelf. And that bookshelf would be, here's the Intel shelf, here's the National shelf, here's the Fairchild shelf, and you pull out the app notes. Okay, I want to make a solid-state radio. Here's the app notes. Here's how you do it. So we had to teach the world how to use these things. So that's built out. Now, what's happening in consolidation was these dozens of technology companies. You're Collins Radio. You're about to build a radio that's got to last 10 years. You got 23 startups of 5 people in the corner, and you're going, well, I don't know if I'm going to bet my company on one of these. So what ends up happening is you have a big consolidation, a shakeout. And you came out with sort of 3 big ones at the end of that: National Semi, Intel, and Texas Instruments. There were others. Fairchild was still considered reasonable. But that's what happens in the second phase. Now, the third phase, commoditization. For semiconductors, what happened was when you got to the 80s, volumes were going up like crazy. The race was how fast you could get your chip to market. You made all your profits in the first 6 months, so it's really important to get it there fast. And then you wrote this experience curve from $100 down to less than $1, and you're selling them like crazy because there's no marginal. Any marginal sales is incremental. The other thing that happened was we invented foundries. So in that time to build a fab would cost several $100 million, which would be like a couple billion today. And most companies couldn't afford that. But now, once they had fabs, you could have these fabless companies building these chips, and things just started sprouting left and right. Well, that's a long way to go through that, but it gives you the cycles, the idea of the cycles and how it works. So we had semiconductors, 10 years later followed by computers, 10 years later followed by network, 10 years later followed by the internet. So how can I go all the way out to 2040? The internet isn't just one value proposition, because all of these end up being a value proposition, right? The internet is 3 value propositions. The first one I call free reach. You call it social mobile. You can reach anybody, anywhere, any set of anybody interest for free. First time you could ever do that. The second decade, which we're in now, is monetization of free reach. We call that Uber, we call that Airbnb. It's the corruption of business models that we live today to take advantage of that economics. And I call it straight-through processing because you eliminate all the barriers, and you literally can get information real time about how you can change your product, service, logistics, supply chain, period. So straight-through processing is important. So what we're doing now is we're in the build-out of that. The next one I call transparency. And why do I call transparency? Because it's about data, right? The lack of transparency is what makes costs go up and knowledge not go back and forth. Well, the growth of data is going astronomical, right? The real key is how can you take that data, turn it into information, in context to what you're doing, turn it into something that is actionable. So you can literally change how you're doing business in real time. That is what we're just starting to figure out now. And we talk about machine learning and all that. That's just part of it. It goes way beyond that. Ultimately, database and file structures restrict how you can query. So you really have to be able to create the semantics on the fly. That's a sort of a metadata plus problem. And then you have to be able to interpret that in context to the situation you're in. So this is going to take a while, and we're just in the first part of the invention stage right now. But you put all those together, and this is going to be an amazing time. What was it? Sloan did a study on the improvement in mankind's lot, and it's all based on productivity. In other words, what can be produced, at lower and lower cost of input. And so they looked at from hunter and gatherers through the first industrial revolution. It was about 40%, 40 to 50. That meant that half of the time of human beings could do things besides staying alive. and so we had churches and states and universities and armies. And during the two industrial revolutions, it's about 100%. So here we are sitting at 2000, about 140% better. They estimated that in the next century, the information revolution and informatics and how it affects all the other markets will be 1,000% improvement. Now, if that's true, nobody on this earth has to live below what we would consider an upper class standard as far as the goods and services available. How we distribute them, what is education, everything, those are different questions. So we live in interesting times. Now let's get back to Silicon Valley. I break it into tiers, same sort of thing. First is the early years. I've already talked about the treacherous 8 and Fairchild, how they launched everything. 64 was probably the first inflection point in venture capital. Venrock, Lawrence Rockefeller, came out here. ArtRock came out here. Bill Draper, who will be here soon, next week. Bill Draper is fabulous. I love Bill Draper. I was on a board with him 25 years ago. And Pitch Johnson, by the way, a West Point grad, founded asset management. So Rockefeller was responsible for, a couple small companies, Intel, Apple, those kind of things. But together, these folks, there were a few others, but they sort of was the first launch. The second launch of Silicon Valley was in 1972. This is when Sand Hill Road was open by Eugene Kleiner, founding Kleiner Perkins, and by Sequoia being founded. It's gotten a lot bigger. A lot of people are there. Actually, there's sort of a move out now to downtown Palo Alto and San Francisco. Still, the offices are more expensive. According to the Wall Street Journal, the most expensive commercial offices in the world are Sand Hill Road. Second most are New York City, third most are University Avenue. A good place to found a startup in the most expensive places in the world. So in the 70s, starting in 74 and going to 81, we had two unbelievable game changers that lifted off venture capital. One was called ERISA, Employment Retirement Income Security Act. So it's what we regulated how investments in retirement funds could be invested. They couldn't invest in risky stuff. In 1978, they amended that to allow retirement funds and pension funds to invest up to 10% of their money in what's now venture capital and private equity. Well, all of a sudden, money was available. In 1977, the year before, $39 million was invested in venture capital. Anybody want to guess what it was the next year, 1 year later? $570 million. Basically 10x in 1 year. So then we had one more inflection point. A Californian movie actor was elected to president in 1980. And he did a bunch of stuff that everybody thought was going to kill the economy, to change all the tax laws and Social Security laws, all that in 81. But one of them was he lowered capital gains tax from 28 to 20. Now, remember I told you about that carry thing? That we get 20 to 25% of all the stuff and it compounds and it grosses back to zero if you get above the 25 and all that's good money. That's long-term capital gains. So you just put an accelerator on the amount of payback to the venture capitalists themselves. So the next inflection point, dozens and dozens of venture capital companies were formed between 81 and 84. It just went through the moon. So those were the game changers. So 78, $570 million, not bad. From then to 96, we got one up to $10 billion. So now we're almost 20x. In 2000, it peaked at $70 billion. I don't have the figures for 2015, but in 2003, it was 10 billion, and in 2014 it was over 50 billion. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. So the Valley in the 70s and 80s, this will be easy now because I've given you the formula. Semiconductors were building out and computers were being invented. Now the computer was invented before that, but it was the mini computer and the PC that moved the needle to the future, and ultimately it was the PC with the server that moved us to where we are today, more and more into commodities. So during the 70s and 80s, venture capital investment went to almost $30 billion. And there was a thing formed in the early 80s called the NVCA, National Venture Capital Association. By 1990, there were 650 companies. So, and that doesn't hold a candle to what there was we're going to be in 1999. So Silicon Valley was going crazy. Semiconductors were there and growing. I already talked about that. The build-out phase, remember, invention, boom and bust, build-out consolidation, and commoditization. All of the companies that are going to really reap the benefits are formed during build-out. So you look at the build-out by the end of build-out, you can pretty much say who the winners are. When commoditization is when what they're selling to, the business models are corrupted, right? So computers and application software were basically invented in the 80s. I say application software. So some small companies like Sun, Apple, Compaq, Ace, Dell, all those that came about. Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Adobe. By the way, in March of 1986, 6 or 85? 86. There had been a long dearth in companies going public. In that 1 month, Microsoft made it out, Apple made it out before the boom happened, but the software hadn't really been invented. So in that 1 month, Sun, Microsoft, Oracle, and Adobe all went public. That was the first window that had opened. I remember the Sun party. I was there. It was ancient times. So networks were invented. Now, the computer network had been around. S&A was going to dominate the world. They had a couple of other technologies that the telcos were pushing. And then this little thing called TCP/IP just sort of undermined everything. The biggest network company in the world in 1990 was Novell. They owned the network. They just thought they were a netware company, not a network company. When Eric Schmidt took over Novell, we were having breakfast. First thing he told me is, if he'd been at Novell, they would have never sold Tuxedo. That's what I used to launch BEA. But then he said, I'm turning this into a TCP/IP company, and we're going to get back to dominating the world. Really hard to change a culture. He wasn't successful in doing it, but the network was born. So two other things happened. Venture went big time beyond technology. That's when they started investing in bio. Bio had the highest returns on average of any industry in venture since then. Little companies called Genentech and stuff like that were formed. And the other thing that happened was we invented something called incubators. I was actually part of one of the very first incubators. It was funded by Mayfield, Kleiner Perkins, and NEA. And it was called Onset Partners. And it still exists today. It's a venture capital company now. But that's what taught me at that era, 1984, that I was not going to, I was an operator, I wasn't a venture capitalist. 26 years later, I got beyond that. So the 90s, okay. So what happened in the 90s? It was the build out of the network. And that's, So what happened to the consolidation? There were many, many, many network companies in 1990. By 2000, there were only two that mattered, Cisco and Juniper. As far as TCP/IP types of networks, because that's all that really mattered at that point anymore, whether it's LAN or WAN. I'm sorry, the 80s is where the incubators were born. The 90s, the network was born, and the network was really built out. Now you think about it, why commoditization didn't happen until around 2000, 2001, because before that you had to pay thousands of dollars to put a network in. After that, some home networks actually existed. Wi-Fi was invented. 3G phones were invented. So all of a sudden you could have broadband, and you could buy it cheaply. I remember in 2000 I paid $295 for a Wi-Fi connection in my house, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, But networks were built out, and that's where the money was made and the companies were made. The internet was invented in August of '92, the World Wide Web, not the internet TCP/IP technology, the World Wide Web by Berners-Lee at CERN. And by the end of that decade, it was going crazy for a boom and a bust, right? But part of these busts are the technology is obviously good, but there's no business model to actually use it, right? So does anybody remember a wild, big investment area called applications server, ASPs, application service providers? You don't remember it. It was one of the biggest, 1%, one of the biggest investment areas in VC world in the late 90s, because they thought, everybody's going to take their applications online. So companies got set up that bought big licenses of Oracle, and they were going to become your Oracle provider. Well, that business model didn't work. It wasn't the business model for what's new. And then I remember I was flying back, you guys are going to hate me when you hear this, from in December of 2000, and I invited this startup guy who just started his company to fly with me back here from George W. Bush's campaign headquarters. That's why you're not going to like this. And his name was Benioff. And he had just started this new startup company. Well, that was the business model. It's designed for it. There's no startup cost. You don't have to train and send in 1,000 engineers to put all the processes in place and make Oracle work. I'm on the Seagate board. We just transitioned from Oracle 11 to Oracle 12, $150 million. That's how, and almost all of it is professional services work. So that model would have never worked. We invented a new model. The other thing that happened, and this is about build out, there were dozens of search engine companies in the boom, dozens of them. This little company called Google started in 1999, and one of my ex-son buddies, got called to drop by and talk to these two engineers, and he liked their idea, so he wrote them a check. You ever heard this story? He wrote them a check for $100,000 on the spot. And they looked at it and said, "We don't have a bank account." And he says, "When you get one, deposit it." Any rate, Andy's probably the top network systems engineer, entrepreneur in the history of Silicon Valley. But on that 100,000, he made over $1 billion. So to add to his others, he was co-founder of Sun as well, and Granite and a bunch of other stuff. He's the nicest guy. Any rate, Google, at the moment broadband went out, that 3G stuff, before that, you probably maybe seen this really old movie where you get on the computer and the modem dials in, now nobody did much searching, and nobody did any shopping to speak of on the internet, and it's just too tedious, right? As soon as you could put Wi-Fi in your house and you could do it, you could get on your telephone, shot through the roof. At that specific moment, Google had the absolute best technology for it. And They had stolen a little monetization model from a company called Overture in Southern California, which ended up in a suit, which Yahoo bought. So Yahoo ended up with $1 billion worth of their stock when they went public, but wouldn't pay the $1 billion to buy Google when the opportunity came up before that. But now things were really taking off. So all these things are what I call a platform. They exist because you build a whole new level of platform that all the next future things are built on. So, the internet's a platform, right? So the first phase of the internet is social. Social became a platform in 2007. Two things happened in 2007. First, the iPhone came out, and second, Facebook added APIs, so other people could add to it. All of a sudden, you had a platform. Now you could build on it. That causes the monetization. So now everybody, was trying to figure out how to compete with that, and everybody was going to be the next Google or the next Facebook and whatever. A little lesson here if you're going to be a venture capitalist. In the world of social mobile on the internet, free reach to everything, there are certain kinds of products and services that the network effect and the long tail means instead of a normalized distribution of winners and losers in a market, it's a power law. So there's really only one winner. And what that means is the one who gets the most users gets the most incremental capability in the long tail. More and more things get added that bring on more users. It becomes a positive feedback loop, and nobody else can catch it, because except where you put in a walled garden like China, there's only been one Facebook in the world, and there's at least one or two other walled gardens, Brazil, and there's only one eBay, and there's only one Amazon, and there's only one Facebook, and it all has to do with those converging laws, and that brings us to this decade, right? So I've talked about the bust and all the things that happened, that the little downturn in 07, 08. But now this is the monetization of two things. Remember I said build out some monetization, and there's only one monetization at a time? There happens to be two. Now, one is the monetization of social, and the other is what I call a mega cycle. And it's the cloud. So the cloud is the end of the data center IT as we know it. We spent the first three cycles building up what became in the data center, right? But what's the internet doing? The internet is now in its, the cloud is now in its build-out phase. By the end of this decade, or around the end of this decade, it will be very obvious that infrastructure as a service is the base winner. There will be lots of software as a service, but they'll be built on infrastructure as a service. And that is a utility. In other words, no enterprise is going to get stuck with only being able to use Amazon for their mission critical world. It's just never going to happen. So having hyper cloud, I've invested in a couple of companies there that are doing pretty well. Having hyper cloud capabilities where for an enterprise, I believe it's going to start with your private cloud and it's going to burst to any number of public cloud, SaaS applications, whatever. Now, that is going to be an amazing thing, because the first thing is you're selling generic IP services, TCP IP services, right? They don't know the difference between a telephone call, a movie, an interactive game, an ERP program, period. It's all the same. It's just another service. What is that going to do when the consolidation happens? All telephone companies, all ISPs, and all cable companies are going to compete for the exact same thing. We've seen this many times before. It turns into a huge battle of who can get the most subscribers by diving the price as low as you possibly can. It squeezes all the economics below it. So the whole IT industry as we know it turns into the telco equipment industry. It's very complex. There's a handful of companies in it, but they're just considered a commodity and nobody really cares about them. But now what's left is this cloud thing. And so number one is the rule that everybody is going for incremental customers, because when the cost of incremental customers approaches zero, you want to get as many as you can, right? And you're in a big competition. That's happened many times. It happened on the cell phone. What hasn't happened is this is a true global market. I can buy from anybody that has a URL as long as I trust them. So organizations are going to set up their hypercloud where they're going to literally be buying capacity based on time of day and the lowest marginal cost, where I may be running on five different public clouds at different levels, and based on the spot price, I'll increase the level there and lower the level here. That's going to drive the cost even. This is going to make capacity unbelievably available. It's going to drive things like crazy. But on the other hand, that's synergistic with this whole putting the world together socially and changing business models. So the next decade is going to see the greatest creation of value in the history of the world. That's my prediction. And that's where you invest if you're going to be in venture capital in the next decade. Above the IT barrier. You don't want to be trying to build a company like I'm running today. You want to either, and there's one other rule. In the IT world, it's about levels of abstraction. And every one of these moves up another level. Remember, I said it's a platform, moves up another level of abstraction. I have a vision for this company of 2 levels of abstraction in the next 10 years. And you got to stay closest to where the customer value is. That's where the most margin and the highest prices are. And if you don't, somebody else will disintermediate you from the customers and you'll be driven down. So there's only 2 places you make money in that kind of market. If you're producing the lowest level commodity, you make money. By the way, the disk drive manufacturers make about 30% gross margin. That's a commodity, right? And then if you're making the very top, everything in the middle there's no value add, it gets squeezed out. That's what's happening to the big computer companies right now, and the big disk drive, storage system companies right now. They're just in the beginning of that squeeze as the internet becomes a utility. I think I took too long. Did I take too long?
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and ask the first question. I think one common hot topic that we're seeing today is around bubbles. Mm-hmm. And obviously you lived through the 2000s and that bubble. What are your views in terms of today and the state of Silicon Valley?
The sea isn't bubbling. There are little pockets of bubbles. But what's driving the frenzy around is this a bubble. I'm talking about venture and high tech. I'm not talking about housing and all that kind of stuff. Is the unicorns. Unicorn is subject to a phenomenon that hasn't happened before the last 5 years. First, it was started with Sarbanes-Oxley. Sarbanes-Oxley drove the cost of going public way up. Before 2000, during the 90s, 2/3 of all venture capital investments ended in an IPO. Since then, it's about less than 25%. Successful, those are the successful monetizations, not the ones that failed. Those are the successful monetizations. So one thing, people were staying, had to stay private longer. So the first thing that developed, which wasn't bad, was a way that you can monetize the stock of your employees. And so there were third parties that would buy. The problem is, if you have too many people that have stock, you got to report as if you're public anyway, even if you aren't a public company, so you may as well go public. So you want to control that, and you do it through these companies. But then what happened about 5 or 6 years ago, hedge funds started to have problems making money. And they decided investing in venture might be a good thing. It's just plant a bunch of seeds, hope some of them succeed. But they weren't going to invest in early venture. They were going to invest in way late, what we used to call mezzanine round, the last round you take before you go public. Then some of the really big mutual funds decided, you know, in the really good IPOs, we can't get enough to invest. Yeah, so they wait, you know, years. Some of them have rules about how long you have to be public and cash flow positive and all that, but they wait years. They decided, well, now if I can get in that mezzanine round and get X percent, and then I can add Y percent at the IPO, and then I can add Z percent, I have what I need. Because, you know, if you're a $300 billion fund, you can't afford to be doing investments. So you're only investing $1 million here and $1 million there. You got to do investments that are big enough. So they all jumped in. Now, so these mezzanine rounds, instead of being 40 or 80 million, they wanted to put lots of million in. So they just bid these things up, and they became billion-dollar valuations. And many of them don't have the basis for that. I mean, I am a seed A and B round investor in Pure Storage. I didn't invest after that. You know, 125 million pre, why should I invest in the C? You know, even as low as it is now, it's still worth 2.5 billion, so I only missed 20 times on my money there, but I made a lot of money. But they weren't ready. Their valuation at 3.2 billion before they went public was way over what it should have been. The same thing was true with Facebook. And Facebook, the face put on Facebook, you know, from Facebook's point of view, there was some problems because they were trying to get the highest possible price they could get. But from the venture side and the investors, they took what, 1.8 billion out at IPO. I mean, that's all that says is you're not trying to create a relationship with your investors for the long term. You're just trying to rape money out of them. To me, that's an absolute wrong signal. It used to be nobody got to take any money out except the public for the first 6 months. You know, and but we've gotten, so there's a bubble there, and there's no doubt there's a bubble. And that's what everybody points to when they say there's a bubble in venture capital. Let me tell you, our fund, we invest $2 to $5 million to get 20 to 30% of a company in the A round, and by the A round, they have to already have a product and customers. You know, and you know what our diligence is? We invest in the seed. Because the only thing important in a startup is the founding team, and if you can't work with the founding team, nothing's going to work. And about half of them don't pass the test. And by the way, 2/3 of our companies end up either failing or we don't invest anymore going forward. And almost all of those are because of the CEO.
I mean, he came from Brazil. I'd like you're talking about the cloud, the hypercloud, and the data center of this evolution. One thing that struggled me for a while is, if I think ahead of time, for me it's a balance between the telco costs and the storage costs. To think about, in the future, all the data centers will be in the same place and do be all communicating through the same place. It will be more distributed. Does it make sense to think in big data centers in all the continents, or would be centralized? I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you see this in the future.
There's going to be no getting out of having big data centers all over the world. You know, number one, you got to follow the sun, and there's all sorts of things you can do if you do that right, and you know, play on the electricity rates and all sorts of stuff. Electricity is the biggest cost in a data center, but it's going to be the local laws. Everybody, that data can't leave Germany. This data can't leave the UK. There's going to be no choice. Now, the data centers will become more and more software defined. They'll become more and more commodity. You know, people are building now data centers in a box, and you just keep plopping the boxes next to one another, plug them in, and move on. Hyperscale is going to make that happen. As soon as all the big guys get into hyperscale, the price is going to just come down to the floor. You know, the Nutanix of the world have a short window in which they can charge exorbitant rents on their scale-out architecture, but that's not going to last long because it's all just commodity and software. Software is where all the value is. Purpose of software is to protect the value of hardware. That's what the first venture investor told me in 1984, and first startup that I started, not joined, but started. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Bill.
And good luck.